It is my pleasure to welcome all of you for this wonderful discussion on advancing equality for women in newsrooms. We'd like to introduce you to our host and moderator today, Couric, who's an anchor, presenter, journalist, and author who's been on every major network, has guided us through the stories for generations, and has been a personal moderator and anchor on this issue in particular. And with that, I'm happy to turn this over to Couric.
Thanks, Carolyn. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for taking time out. Craig Newmark, we're going to be on a Zoom for most of the day because Craig is also involved in the Aspen Institute's Commission on Disinformation, which I am chairing. So I hope we can take some time to stretch Craig after this hour because the other thing starts at 1 o'clock. So let me just tell you all, we're going to set the stage surrounding inequality in the press by giving you basically some numbers. So the Press Forward onboarded national news organizations into McKinsey and Leanin.org's Women in the Workplace study, finding that women enter the industry at parity with men, but drop off at every level to comprise only a fraction of leadership. I think some of us have seen these slides before, but the Press Forward's work and research finds women lead the industry because they're harassed, paid less, face inequality at home, and are denied opportunities for advancement and promotions into leadership. These imbalances affect the journalism itself. When newsrooms are male dominated, it impacts whether or not stories about women are told. Now, of course, I learned this firsthand anchoring the CBS Evening News, fighting for stories to be covered like dating violence, military sexual assault, that otherwise would not have been. Research, in fact, commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2020 confirms this. Over the last few decades, as you see on the slide, women's stories are underrepresented in the news compared to men's at a ratio of approximately 1 to 5. And between 2005 and 2015, fewer than 1 in 5 experts globally in the news were women. So clearly gender equality is a worldwide issue, but we can't solve a problem we can't see, and it's not well reported, even in journalism. The Gates report also found that gender equality issues are not front of mind for decision makers and opinion formers, including journalists themselves. This has contributed to news coverage of gender equality being marginalized, with less than 1% of all stories covering gender equality in 2019. And within these gender equality stories, men form the majority of the story's protagonists. Now, all of you are here because you're in a position to make a real difference in the industry. So to help us understand some evidence-based solutions, I'm really excited to be introducing our guest, Siri Chalazi from the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard, whose research finds ways to move the needle on advancing women at work and in the press. You know, this whole conversation actually was prompted by my support of implicit bias training. And Siri's going to talk about how that will only go so far in actually moving the needle, that we have to have very, specific systems and changes in the systems that are in place that are providing or preventing women and representation in media of all kind. But Siri is a recognized expert in advancing women and promoting gender equality within organizations. She specializes in translating academic research into practical approaches that we can all use and tools to design more inclusive workplaces. She has an MBA from Harvard Business School, a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and a BA in chemistry and physics from Harvard College. Clearly, she's a real lightweight. So Siri, tell us what we can do to make workplaces more inclusive.
Katie, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Also, thank you for summarizing my presentation for me. That was spot on. I think we can go home now. No, but seriously, thank you also to all of you for joining. It's so lovely. It's such an honor and a joy to be here joining you to share a little bit about the research on what works to level the playing field for women at work more broadly, but specifically in news and media organizations, and how we can move from good intentions, which I assume really everyone has, to effective action and to real change on the ground. Let me quickly share my screen and you all will tell me if you're not seeing the slides now. I'd like to begin by introducing you to behavioral design as what's probably a new approach to many of us to leveling the playing field and to making organizational change. And then I'd like to share with you a couple of very specific, tangible ways in which we can apply behavioral design as organizational leaders to help move the needle. So that's where we're headed. I'm planning on speaking for no more than 20 minutes, but I warmly welcome interruptions, questions, challenges throughout. So we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end, but don't hesitate to talk over me at any time if something comes to mind that you want to share immediately. So I'd like to start by asking you to take a look at this checkerboard, in particular the squares labeled A and B, and determine which of them is darker. And I'll ask you to keep looking at A and B as I quickly cover up their surroundings. By now, if you feel like changing your answer, I can promise you you're not alone. So let me go back just to convince you that truly all I did was covered up the surroundings here. What this exercise allows us to experience firsthand is the effect of unconscious bias on our decision-making. The overwhelming majority of information that we take in is actually processed by the unconscious rather than the conscious part of our brain. And research shows that this unconscious part of our brain is extremely prone to patterns, to heuristics, to shortcuts in order to process this massive amount of information, 11 million individual pieces of information per second, and to make decisions. So the moment the screen flashed in front of your eyes, you probably instantaneously and unconsciously recognized a familiar pattern of a light square next to a dark square, and you determined that A is darker than B, which in this case is not true. One more question for you here. Now that I've told you there are two squares of the same color, how many of you looking at this still see A as being darker than B? Yes, no?
Yes.
Right? I've seen this about 7,000 times. So yes, we are all unconsciously biased. That's one takeaway. It's simply an aspect or a facet of how our brains process information. But I think that actually the more important insight is that that bias is so stubborn that merely acknowledging its existence or even being aware of its effects, like we are right now on this checkerboard, isn't enough to overcome it. Our brains need some additional help. And here, that help is the blinders that quite literally take away the pattern. And once the pattern is gone, your brain now has no trouble seeing squares A and B for what they really are. I wanted to start here with unconscious bias, firstly, because research shows that it continues to be probably the number one barrier to having real equity and inclusion and diversity in organizations, both at the individual level and at the kind of collective organizational level. But also, secondly, because it's really important to understand what we're up against in order to understand what works to solve the problem. With unconscious bias in particular, a very common and popular way of trying to solve the problem is through training. Whether we call it unconscious bias training, diversity training, inclusion training, the idea is that we can have people sit in a session for 2 or 8 or 24 hours and learn about some of the facts of bias, and that will somehow make the bias disappear from their brain. Now, I'm here to be the bearer of bad news today because sadly, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that this works. We've been studying the brain, but also trainings and diversity trainings for more than 50 years. And not a single study suggests that any type of training of any length will actually debias our brains fundamentally or even lead to behavior change. Now, if you ask people right after this training, did they learn something new? they will absolutely say yes. I hope that many of you have already learned something new in our first 3 minutes together. Also, if you ask these people if they have an intention to now behave differently and in less biased ways, they will also tell you yes. But then when we follow up with these individuals 3, 6, 12 months later and observe their behaviors to see if anything actually has changed, the answer is no. And likewise, if we look at broader organizational outcomes like who is actually there, representation, who gets hired, who is in leadership, who has been getting promoted, likewise, we see absolutely no change. So if trainings don't work, then that begs the question, what does? What does work? How can we attack the perilous consequences of unconscious bias in our workplaces? And this is where I'd like to introduce you to the concept of behavioral design. Those of you who watched Katie's amazing National Geographic documentary will be familiar with the story already of how symphony orchestras in the US have dramatically gender diversified their ranks. They were about 5% female musicians in the early 1970s, and they're about 40% female musicians today. And as you can guess by now, they didn't accomplish this transformation by sending the orchestra directors to any kind of unconscious bias training, but rather they made a small process change in how they hired new musicians. They started auditioning these musicians behind a curtain. And what this curtain did for the orchestra directors is exactly what those blinders did for all of us on the checkerboard a moment ago, which is it liberated them from any patterns, any stereotypes, any expectations that the orchestra directors might have had about what an orchestra musician is supposed to look like. And instead, it allowed them to focus on the information that truly mattered, which was the quality of the performance and the actual sound of the music. Now, the big irony with orchestras, by the way, is that they play in a pit anyway. The audiences can never even see them anyways. So truly who they are should not matter one bit. And that's the magic of behavioral design. Behavioral design builds on decades of research from fields like neuroscience and psychology and economics, our understanding of how human brains work. And it allows us to design environments and processes and structures that enable our inherently biased brains to nonetheless make better decisions. In other words, we're not trying to debias individual brains, we are debiasing the systems that those brains have created. And what I think is the real magic of behavioral design is that it allows us to improve our decision-making even when we don't think there's anything wrong with it in the first instance. If you had asked these orchestra directors in the late 1960s if they were picking the best musicians for their orchestras, they would have said, yes, of course, that's my job. But demonstrably, they made different decisions and they selected different people before and after the curtain. And I would argue they selected better people and made more unbiased decisions after the curtain. This is particularly relevant in high-pressure environments, in fast-paced situations like journalism, like the media, because research shows that in those high-pressure, fast-paced situations, our brains rely even more than usual on those shortcuts and patterns to help us with decision-making. In other words, there's an even greater danger of us making biased decisions. So let me take a quick pause here and see if you have any reactions, challenges, questions before we talk about how to put this into practice in our own organizations.
Yeah. Siri, I just wrote in the chat that that orchestra auditions are now even using carpeting on your way to auditioning behind the curtain, so that the people who are evaluating the music won't be able to determine if someone's wearing high heels.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Siri, hi, Ayanna Jackson here at NPR Learning and Development. I would just add that you're so on point with training doesn't solve everything. And I have so many of my clients within the newsroom and across the business who come to my department and say, we've got a problem, we need training. That's never, that's not always the solution. Sometimes it is, but you hit the nail right on the head with that. And I was just over here testifying like, yes, that is so very true. So really, really good point.
Thanks, Ayanna. And I should just restate again, right? To your point, it works to raise awareness. If we put people through training, they are going to learn something. They're going to gain new information, and they feel the effect of that. They're like, oh, wow, I really learned something. But I think the holy grail for most of us is we want behavior change, which then leads to organization change and numbers change and inclusion experience change. And with that part, it just hasn't been shown to be effective. All right, let me take this opportunity, this slow pause, to quickly move on, because then I'm excited to get into the more robust and longer part of our conversation. So I want to share with you 5 specific organizational practices that have been research studied and tested and shown to work to both debias decision-making and lead to more diversity and inclusion in our organizations on a very real and practical level. And the first relates to formality and structure in organizational processes like sourcing, hiring, could even be performance evaluations, promotions. We'll talk about that a little bit later. At a high level and in a nutshell, what we know is that structure and formality is the enemy of bias, whereas informality and ad hoc decision-making is a breeding ground for bias. So if currently in your organization, you rely heavily on referrals from existing employees, for example, in hiring, or you have a coffee meeting with a young, budding, aspiring journalist who kind of reminds you of you when you're younger, and you're like, oh, sure, let's find you an internship. We'll put you on this team. And 3 months later, that leads to that person getting hired into a full-time position. That is much less likely to lead to true equality of opportunity and diversity in your organization than if you systematically wrote and posted job descriptions for every open role and circulated them in forums, right, or through channels with a specific eye toward exposing those opportunities to talent that you might not have seen before, whether that's historically Black colleges and universities or women's groups within journalism colleges, right, or whatever have you. But it's being very structured and formalized about those types of processes and ensuring that you have a set of criteria, for example, that you evaluate all new hires against very consistently and very systematically, that will help to debias the hiring process decision-making and any process decision-making, really. How might you track whether this is working, and how might you even track whether there are currently biases in who's entering your organizations and how they're progressing through? This is where data comes in as an essential tool. I've had the great pleasure over the last couple of years of studying the BBC's 50/50 project, which some of you might be familiar with. It started with this gentleman on the left here, Roz Atkins, who I like to call the Anderson Cooper of the UK, but he's an anchor of a BBC nightly primetime news show. And in early 2017, he had this feeling that he probably wasn't representing women equally and featuring them equally on his show, but there was no data. So he didn't actually know whether that was the case. So he and his production team started counting at the end of each day's show how many women and men had appeared on screen during that hour. They literally took 1 minute to just tally. And indeed, they started, by the way, at 39% women the first month. By 4 months later, they had made it up to 51%, and they've been there pretty much ever since then. And once they had kind of established this methodology, they started sharing it widely within the BBC with other teams. Fast forward to today, as of the latest, this project is not only in global use within the BBC, but it's spread to more than 100 partner organizations that include other media organizations, but also journalism schools and even large multinational companies. So the concept is really simple. There's a goal, which is to aim for 50-50 representation of women and men, whether this is on the TV screen or in terms of people you quote in a written story, or even on the radio in terms of voices you hear and the artists that have produced the music that you play. The data is counted or created really by the content creators themselves. So instead of an HR executive somewhere removed collecting and tracking this data, it's the producers, the editors, the journalists themselves that on a daily basis generate the data by counting, and importantly, on a monthly basis, share it with other participating teams. So within the BBC, there's a monthly update where all participating teams get to see how they're doing against all other participating teams. And once a year, the BBC makes this data public to anyone and everyone out there in the world. And so this really captures some of the key learnings that we already know from research about how we can use data as an engine to drive change. The BBC story is just so beautiful because it really captures all of it. You need to track the data, both in order to establish a baseline, but also to know how you're progressing. That data needs to be either tracked or at the very least made available to the people whose daily decisions shape what that data looks like. And thirdly, transparency and accountability are two of the most powerful levers to change people's behavior, because we simply behave in better ways and in less biased ways when we know that we're being watched. And here's an example of how data can expose a very straightforward but powerful and really impactful gender gap in the workplace. The picture here refers to a study that was done in the two leading stock brokerage firms in the US. Researchers compared the output of female and male stockbrokers at these firms and noticed that women were only bringing in 60% as much revenue as their male counterparts, the stockbrokers. But when they dug deeper into the data, they actually found that the women's and men's performance was the same. So think about that for a second. I'm telling you that objectively, the women are bringing in less revenue, yet I'm also telling you that they are actually performing equally as well as the men. Does anyone have a guess as to how that's possible?
Opportunity.
Yes, say more about that.
Well, it goes back to your prior slide too. It's great to have 51% of women, but what topics are they talking on? So that is something that we're starting to track and have been doing for the last year. But having worked at Bloomberg, not all accounts are created equal, right? And the money value, if you're playing in a smaller pool, you're going to bring in less dollars. So you can't look at the numbers in absolute terms. You have to look at the opportunity.
Yes, spot on. Literally, couldn't have said it better myself. So the women tended to be assigned smaller accounts in historically worse performing accounts, which led them to have inferior opportunities to close sales. So the issue actually wasn't any of the stockbrokers' performance. It was the bias baked into the, what I would call, work allocation process. And the larger phenomenon at play here is something we call performance support bias, which is exactly as you said, this near universal phenomenon that not everyone gets the same support or resources to succeed, which is in no way correlated with skills or ability. So in the news context, think about which beats people get assigned to, which specific stories they're assigned to cover. If there's a really sexy high visibility assignment that comes up, how is it determined who gets to work on that assignment? Even things like the location of your desk within a physical space. At MIT, a study showed that the faculty that had offices that were located more centrally tended to do better than the faculty who were relegated to the far off offices. This could also be things like access to leadership training programs, or access to professional executive coaching, or even having an executive assistant, right? Or some logistical assistance. All these types of resources are measurable and they can be tracked. And if indeed you start to track, my very strong guess is, just looking across all the different organizations where we have ever tracked this, that you're going to notice there are certain groups that get more access to these opportunities than others. But the good news is, and the flip side of that is, once we expose the gaps, we then know how to fix them. And we can change the processes whereby we assign people to stories or whereby we assign people to beats to help to equalize this disparity. And this leads me directly to my next point more broadly about career advancement, which includes performance evaluations and promotions, which is this finding, very robust finding from the research, that men tend to get promoted on potential, whereas women tend to get promoted on performance. So we look at a guy and he quite frankly looks like a lot of the people who have gone before him and been successful in the past. And we say, yeah, he's got potential. He can figure this out. He's gonna get there. And then we look at the equivalent woman and say, well, she hasn't done that yet. She didn't work on that type of project. She hasn't managed, or she hasn't been an account executive. I need to see a demonstrated track record before I can promote her to those responsibilities. So quite simply, we hold women to a much higher standard for advancement than we do men, which ends up hurting them big time. And those effects compound over time as people move up in their careers. Research shows that the simplest and best antidote to this is having very clear and openly communicated criteria for what people need to provide evidence of in order to advance to any particular level. And the key here is openly communicated. These criteria should not just be available to the evaluators, the people who make the decisions about promotions. They should also be available and very actively shared with, in this case, the journalists themselves, so that they know exactly which boxes they're going to be expected to check for them to get that high profile assignment or move to the next level. And then, of course, we have to keep ourselves accountable to applying these criteria rigorously and consistently across everyone, and not making exceptions for the folks who we feel like, that they should be advancing faster. Because those gut instincts and, oh, but I just really like this guy, but I just know he's going to be great. That's basically pure bias when it comes to evaluation. One final thing I'd like to share with you, and this is actually a quick little interactive exercise if you'll indulge me. I'd like you to think of the names of around 5 people that you really trust in your professional network, so family excluded. But if you had a big dilemma at work, if you really needed good advice, whom would you turn to? I'll give you just a minute to think of those names and write down. Don't worry, you won't have to share. This is completely personal to you. And then when you're ready, write down some characteristics of these people. For example, their gender, their approximate age, race or ethnicity, whether they are a parent, and whether they're a member of the LGBTQ+ community, to the extent that you know. And I'll give you just a minute to write those down. And when you're done, I'll ask you to just add one final row to the bottom, and that is yourself. Your name and all of those same characteristics for yourself. Mimi is smiling. Mimi, do you have an observation that you'd like to share?
Yes, most of them mirror me on those dimensions.
Yeah. Anybody else have an observation or a reflection that you'd feel comfortable sharing?
Many don't mirror me because my mentors earlier on in the business were very unlike me. They were, sort of, yeah.
Was that intentional or unintentional?
No, I think that, in terms of people who, it's not everybody on the list, but in terms of 1 or 2 people who I had the level of experience I'd be sort of seeking, they're white men. They were previous bosses or supervisors, so they're very, very unlike me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love getting both of those reflections. All experiences are valid, of course. The take-home message, if there's one thing I want to leave you with from this exercise, is that our networks matter greatly, right? And often our networks closely mirror ourselves. This is yet another unconscious bias that we all share. You might have heard it by the name of in-group bias or homophily, but we humans tend to be inherently more comfortable associating with other people who are similar to us along various different dimensions. So if you have just a hypothetical example, a group of 5 white news executives in a room, and they're trying to come up with the names of journalists of color who could cover some story, it's going to be, on average, a lot harder for those people to generate a good list of names than an adjacent room with 5 journalists of color in that room. They could probably generate a list that was 10 times as long in a much shorter amount of time, simply because they tend to have those networks. So who you have in the room when you're brainstorming the topics of stories, the journalists who could cover them, right? The people who you might interview as specialists for a given story. we all have massive blind spots in which names and what names happen to pop into our minds when we're having those conversations. And the more diversity we have around the table when we're having those discussions, the higher the likelihood that the output that we generate is also more diverse, more inclusive, and appeals to a broader demographic. So I'm going to stop there. That's a quick recap of the 5 evidence-based strategies that I just shared. And I'll just quickly pop my email on here. If any of you would like to continue the conversation outside of today's meeting or have follow-up questions, I would be absolutely delighted to stay in touch.